I'd like to start again by thanking Lou and James to let me speak here. And again, I'm conscious that this session is devoted towards discussion, not listening to me. So again, I'll be correspondingly brief also because I'm more of a plotting empiricist than one who paints on such a large canvas as world government and so on. So again, picking up on a couple of the thoughts and themes that I've heard expressed in the proceedings today, I mean, I'm really keen to in some sense start with a conclusion in decentering the state from discussions of world government and instead emphasize a conversation that works on function rather than form, picking up on Professor Kincaid's line as well. That rather than that, it seems to me that much of the discussion, again from my unfortunately very superficial acquaintance with it, about world government has worked on this analogy that we have a recognizable institution of the state at this national level, and that the way we get to world government is to upsize or supersize this, so we get something that recognizably follows the Westphalian state, but somehow is just bigger. So in the sense that we have a national legislature, we have a world legislature. In the sense that we have a national judiciary and executive, so too those institutions are replicated at the world level. And that just as we solve problems of representation in federations like the United States, Canada, Australia, whatever it might be, so too we have to weight particular legislative functions in the house or houses of legislature that we have at the world level as well. And to me this seems kind of a profoundly unhelpful way of really talking about world government, and instead for me it seems that the discussion should be what sort of functions do we want to have done, and only then really think about what institutions or what practices can get those functions done or achieved, whether it's extending human rights, whether it's providing public goods at a global level, whatever it might be. So rather than starting with the institution that we want and thinking about how to upscale this, instead you start with discussion of functions. I think in decentering the state, the discussion has mainly been about the future, and this raises the problems that Mark has brought up. In the long run, we're all dead. You can say anything you like about the future, and unless it's in the very short term, it's almost impossible to be disconfirmed. We buy into this, arguably, this teleological reasoning of extending from this point into the future, which may be a very misleading way of reasoning. So you've got the talk about global governance, this modish term from the 1990s, still sort of with us, that people say we extend that into the future, or this idea of what the European Union is now. Is it a postmodern state in the way that James Caporoso says? Is it something else? But I think in some ways, really the more productive discussion in decentering the state and getting away from this institution is exactly the opposite, to talk about the past in a different way. And I think that there may be many good reasons to be skeptical about the practice of world government, but one of the, I think the most common reason adduced for skepticism about world government is very wrong. And this is this idea that the state is the natural or enduring way of organizing policies in human history, and that states' overwhelming function is to protect their sovereignty. And I think we can go back into the surprisingly recent past and find out this is an extremely misleading idea. First off, that states are incredibly recent. They're the exception rather than the rule in the way that humans have organized their political affairs. And in fact, even if you look at the states, states in many instances have been surprisingly willing to either give away aspects of their sovereignty or in fact give up sovereignty entirely and form some greater union. So one of my favorite books about this issue is one by Tanisha Fazal, looking at the issue of state death in international relations. Tracking it, admittedly, the data she uses is pretty Eurocentric, but still, again, it's from 1815 to around about, I think the book was published in 2007, so the data goes up to the end of the 90s. And she finds out that contrary to the belief of the realist international relations people who've been talked about, like John Mearsheimer, if states die, it's overwhelmingly through voluntarily giving up their sovereignty to join some greater whole, rather than being conquered and exploited in the way that we tend to think of happened in earliest, in World War II and World War I, in the colonial experience and so on. Mark again has mentioned David Kang, looking at getting away from this sort of Eurocentric thing. This idea of in East Asia, again, sovereignty is incredibly, or at least Westphalian sovereignty is incredibly new and perhaps a transient idea that Kang's idea of instead the hierarchy being the natural order of things in East Asia from around about 1000 to some point in the 19th century, just before the Europeans showed up, and that you had this hierarchical system centered on China, where at least in many places at many times you had fairly voluntary compliance from subordinate entities who bought into this idea of a sinocentric universe, and that it wasn't just about coercion and empire building in the way that we think about now. Finally, even if you think about Australia, Australia was surprisingly reluctant to take up the prerogatives of sovereignty, and really, in some sense, you can say, well, look, Australia went from part of the British Empire to 1st of January 1901 to being a sovereign state. But in fact, there was a long period of several decades where Australia was reluctant to take up the things that we think that a quote-unquote normal country should have. Australia was quite happy for people in London to make decisions about war and peace until the 1940s. Australia doesn't have citizenship until 1948. Australians regarded as being second-class English people up until that point. And then in fact there was a whole slew of constitutional and foreign affairs prerogatives where Australia was happy to follow the imperial model. And what we see in the 1950s when we talk about other sorts of alternatives is not just the European story of forming what then became the European Union, but these other sorts of stories about in the decolonisation process where there were other models that could have happened apart from the sovereign state that were discussed, that didn't get up, but could have and perhaps might in the future. I'll leave it there. Thanks. Thanks very much.